So, Paula, you were at a January 6th watch party yesterday, and you spoke to Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio's mother. Just a reminder for our viewers that Tarrio was convicted of sedition. He had been sentenced to the longest sentence of all, 22 years, compared to others who had been convicted. Tell us about that conversation and what else happened at this watch party.
Yes, Anna, so to give you some context, I'm talking to you right now from Café Versalles. So Café Versalles, this place is in the heart of Miami-Dade County in a neighborhood called Little Havana. Now, this neighborhood is exactly where Enrique Tarrio grew up, not too far from where I'm talking to you. And in just a couple of hours, according to his family, at 6:30 p.m., Enrique Tarrio will be taking a flight, a Southwest flight, and will be landing right here in Miami. I think in a couple of hours, you can expect to see some type of party right here in Versalles. But less than 24 hours ago, as you mentioned, Anna, I was at a January 6th pardon watch party. That party was organized by Gabriel Garcia. Gabriel Garcia is one of Enrique Tarrio's friends, and he is also the son of Cuban immigrants. He's a veteran. He's a Proud Boy. Gabriel Garcia, is someone that was sentenced to 1 year in prison due to his actions on January 6th. And at 7:30 p.m. yesterday, we saw him cutting off his court-ordered ankle bracelet that he was having there. It was a sort of celebration of the moment. And at that watch party that you can see right there, that's where I had the opportunity to talk to Enrique Tarrio's mom. And this is what she told me.
He also knew that President Trump is going to do the correct thing. So he has a lot of faith, and he still believes in our justice system and in our Constitution. I think President Trump told people to go to the Capitol peacefully and manifest peacefully. What happened after that between point A and point B is a whole different issue.
So you don't blame?
I don't. Absolutely not. I think we're responsible for our own actions.
Enrique Tarrio's mom doesn't blame him. No one here that is with the Proud Boys blames President Trump. And so the question is, what does all of this mean in a place like Miami-Dade County that saw the very vivid rise of the Proud Boys, that saw the rise of someone like Enrique Tarrio going from just an ordinary Cuban-American person that was in these streets to one of the most powerful and dangerous people in American politics?
Paula, I have to wonder, what could these pardons do for recruiting for organizations like the Proud Boys or other far-right groups?
I think that is the question, Anna, but perhaps this may give us some insights. Right after that watch party that we saw on our screen, Gabriel Garcia, who was cutting off that ankle bracelet, drove over 4 hours to the Coleman federal prison, and there he was waiting for the release of over 12 January 6 rioters. And in that video, when you can see him, not what we're seeing on screen, but there's a video that he showed us this morning where he calls his fellow January 6 rioters. He says, "These are heroes, no, let them out." There you go, we can hear them there.
Let's go!
So interesting to see those reactions. We'll obviously have a lot to follow today in terms of what is next for some of these January 6th convicted rioters now pardoned, and obviously what it means for the Department of Justice moving forward. Paula Ramos, thank you so much for your reporting. Really appreciate it. April, I spoke to a number of Trump supporters yesterday. I was at Capital One Arena during the inauguration, and I asked them, ahead of Trump actually issuing this broad 1,500-plus pardon, if they thought people who had been convicted of violent crimes for their actions that day should be pardoned. And here's what they said.
Here's the deal. If you did violence on January 6th, then you should be held accountable for doing violence. But if the police invited you into the Capitol and you followed the police into the Capitol and you were peaceful and you went to jail, you should be pardoned, you should be freed, and the government should be held accountable for what they did.
No. If you were violent, I don't care whether or not you were Republican or Democrat or independent, whoever, we should all have one justice system. No one is above the law.
Even the recent polling shows solid majorities disapprove of January 6 pardons. We heard J.D. Vance, Vice President Vance, a few days ago saying violent January 6 offenders shouldn't be pardoned. So, April, are you surprised President Trump went this far? What's the calculation?
Well, the answer is simple, Anna. I'm not surprised because this was a campaign promise that he fulfilled. And one thing that I've learned about Donald Trump, and all of us have learned, and some of us haven't taken it in and engaged with it and embraced it, but when he says something, he means it. It was heartening to see those that you talked to yesterday say that, no one is above the law. That if there was violence, you should pay. But this president, he did what he did. And at the end of the day, we saw just blocks from where we're sitting right now, people with bear spray, axe, picks, maps even, to find the spaces and places where James Clyburn's office was, Nancy Pelosi's office, and others. If they would have touched a hair on any of the congressional leaders' head, we would not be sitting here today. And that's the end of the story. But Donald Trump fulfilled a campaign promise. And what he's saying is, again, the election was stolen from me then.
He can't let that go. He keeps talking about 2020 even in these first 24 hours as he returns to the White House. He also, Trump, pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He pulled out of the World Health Organization. He pushed back the TikTok ban. He's been making a blatant play to override the Constitution by ending birthright citizenship. Eugene, what do you make of all these actions he prioritized for day one?
Yeah, April's right that these are promises made, promises kept for Donald Trump, right? These are things that he said he was going to do. He signaled, or he said and was very explicit. Also, on the January 6th, the pardons and whether or not folks that you talked to yesterday will change their mind. What we've seen with Donald Trump and his supporters is that they are very much going to seem to follow him when he changes his mind on something. So even though there was a signal that the violent folks weren't going to get pardons, they did. And so now I would be very interested to see the polling over the next couple of weeks, and few weeks, to see how that has shifted and whether or not the people who said that those violent folks should not have gotten pardons have changed their tune because Donald Trump says they should have. But on the other executive orders are also always kind of a political signal, right? I hear you, the things that I said I was going to do, I'm not waiting on Congress to make these things happen. Donald Trump fully understands the kind of marketing and PR and bully pulpit of the presidency in a way that others haven't. And I think some of these things, birthright citizenship at the top of that list, he is daring folks to sue them. He is daring, the Supreme Court to take it up as they have in the past, and kind of solidify that this is a constitutional right. He is daring that to happen. He is pushing, and I've talked to folks who've been in touch with now DOJ Trump officials, and they say that those folks are going in, both these EOs and other legal aspects, about thinking of how to stretch the limits and go to the edges of where they can. That is something that has been made very clear. I think this is a perfect example of them doing something like that. When you talk to folks who like Donald Trump, even if, the Supreme Court says you can't get rid of birthright citizenship with an executive order, what they like about it is that he tried and he's testing and pushing. And sometimes, like it came with the immunity that he received, a lot of folks in the legal community said there's no way the Supreme Court would take this up and give the president some type of sweeping immunity. That would end up not being true. So the testing of it sometimes gets him and his supporters exactly what they want.
We're also seeing such a contrast already of what we saw Trump term 1 and Trump term 2 here, April. I remember back on Inauguration Day in 2017, he signed one executive order that day. It had something to do with Obamacare.
Yeah.
Yesterday, term 2, he signed 26 executive orders. He had 20 executive actions as well. And some of this stuff he was signing in front of that big crowd at the arena. So he wanted to really highlight what he was doing for them. What does it tell you about his approach to this second term?
He wants to look more presidential, and he's making it clear who his friends are and who his enemies are. His friends are those who supported him. He's giving them everything he promised and that they loved. Those who he is against, he's against the prior Democratic administrations from Obama to Biden. But also, think about this. We're waiting to hear what he's going to do with those now American oligarchs, right? All of those who sat there. So let's see what those executive orders are. And lastly, on the executive orders and the signing.
And you're talking about the tech CEOs.
Yeah, the tech CEOs. Yes, I'm sorry. But I can't help but watch Senator Amy Klobuchar and her angst. while Donald Trump was signing those executive orders that are now standing in America. Job freezes. He has executive orders that are now allowing him to build a wall without anybody in the southern border, without anybody stopping him. He is doing what he said he would do and what he wants to do in this moment.
But as Eugene mentioned, there will be pushback, and we're already seeing some legal pushback.
Let's see how much.
Eugene, I want to ask you also about how he rescinded 78 executive orders from the Biden administration. So that was one of the actions he took. Some of the things he had reversed were things that President Biden had issued executive orders that were reversals of the Trump actions from his first administration. So I think it just goes to show how I guess, short-term some of these specific orders and actions can be. How much of what he did in the last 24 hours can be reversed and is just going to continue to ping-pong?
Yeah, executive orders and actions, the reasons that some presidents don't like them is because they aren't law, right? they can be, they can happen with the pen and they can be taken away with the pen. We saw him do that yesterday. Joe Biden did that. Barack Obama did that. Everyone has done that over and over again. And so whoever is the next president, if it's a Democrat, a lot of these things and also others that we'll see over the next 4 years will probably be rescinded as well. That is one of the weirder parts of our democracy. And it's something that presidents nowadays use a lot more than they have in the past. And so the back and forth and kind of the uncertainty that certain industries have when looking at what they could do and now what they can't do, that changes the way that even businesses operate in this country. So it has long-standing effects when the ping-ponging happens.